Here is a question that should bother you more than it probably does. In 1750, a peasant farmer in the Yangtze Delta of China and a peasant farmer in rural England were living remarkably similar lives. Their caloric intake was comparable. Their life expectancy was comparable. The sophistication of the economies around them was comparable. China had printing presses centuries before Gutenberg. It had gunpowder, advanced irrigation, a complex civil service, and a merchant class of extraordinary commercial sophistication. The Mughal Empire in India was producing approximately 25% of global GDP. The Ottoman Empire controlled the most strategically significant trade routes in the known world. Europe was not ahead. By almost any measure you choose to apply in 1750, Europe was not the dominant civilization on Earth. It was one of several sophisticated civilizations competing for resources and influence in a world where the advantages were distributed relatively evenly across Eurasia. By 1850, 1 century later, everything had changed. Britain was producing half the world's iron and cotton cloth. Western European nations were carving up Asia and Africa into colonial territories. The gap between the industrial economies of northwestern Europe and every other civilization on Earth had opened into a chasm so wide that it would define the political and economic structure of the entire world for the next 2 centuries. 100 years. That is all it took. The most consequential economic divergence in human history happened in the span of a single century. And historians have been arguing about why ever since. This is the Great Divergence. And it is the greatest detective story in the history of economics. Not because the outcome is mysterious. We know what happened. Europe industrialized and the rest of the world did not, or did not fast enough, or was actively prevented from doing so by the very powers that were industrializing. What is mysterious, genuinely contested, and deeply consequential for how we understand the modern world, is why. Why did a handful of small, frequently cold, frequently wet nations on the western edge of the Eurasian landmass make the leap that changed everything? Why not China, which had more of almost every relevant resource and a more sophisticated bureaucratic and commercial tradition? Why not India, which was already the world's dominant textile producer? Why not the Ottoman Empire, which controlled the crossroads of global trade? The answers that historians have developed fall into 2 broad camps that disagree with each other so fundamentally that choosing between them is not just an academic exercise. It is a choice about how you understand the relationship between human agency and historical circumstance. Between culture and luck. Between the idea that the West succeeded because of something it did and the idea that it succeeded because of something it had. Before we get to those answers, we need to spend a moment with the question itself. Because the question only makes sense if you accept the premise. And the premise, that the world before 1800 was broadly comparable across Eurasia in ways that the subsequent divergence was not inevitable, is itself a radical challenge to the story that Western civilization has been telling about itself for 200 years. The story that Western civilization prefers is one of linear progress. Of a Europe that was always more rational, more innovative, more commercially sophisticated, more institutionally developed than the civilizations it eventually came to dominate. A Europe whose eventual global dominance was the predictable outcome of inherent superiority that had been accumulating since the Greeks, through the Romans, through the Renaissance, through the scientific revolution, arriving inevitably at the Industrial Revolution and the global dominance that followed. That story is wrong. The evidence that it is wrong has been accumulating in the work of economic historians for 30 years, most powerfully in Kenneth Pomeranz's landmark 2000 study The Great Divergence, which demonstrated through careful comparison of living standards, agricultural productivity, commercial sophistication, and proto-industrial development that the Yangtze Delta and the most advanced regions of northwestern Europe were, as late as 1750, broadly comparable in their economic development. The divergence was not the culmination of a long-running European advantage. It was a sudden break, a discontinuity. Something changed, very quickly, in a very specific place, and the consequences of that change radiated outward to reshape the entire world. What changed is the detective story, and the 2 main suspects could not be more different. The first suspect is luck. Specifically, geographical luck of a kind so precise and so consequential that it is almost impossible to believe it was not designed. Kenneth Pomeranz and the revisionist historians who built on his work argue that the critical difference between Britain and China in 1800 was not culture, not institutions, not the Protestant work ethic or the scientific revolution or any of the internal characteristics that Western historians have traditionally credited with producing industrialization. It was coal. And it was the Americas. Britain had coal deposits of extraordinary scale and quality located, by geological accident, directly adjacent to the emerging industrial centres of the Midlands and the North. The steam engine that powered the Industrial Revolution ran on coal. The iron furnaces that produced the iron that built the machines ran on coal. The entire energetic foundation of the industrial economy was coal. And Britain had it exactly where it needed it, at a cost that made the energy-intensive processes of industrial production economically viable in a way that they would not have been if the coal had been further away or deeper underground or of lower quality. China also had coal. It had enormous coal deposits. But China's coal was in the north and northwest, in Shaanxi and Shaanxi, while the economically sophisticated, densely populated, commercially developed regions of China were in the Yangtze Delta in the south and east. The geography of Chinese coal relative to Chinese economic development meant that the energy transition that Britain made relatively smoothly in the late 18th century would have required China to solve an entirely different and considerably more difficult logistical problem first. The coal was there. The economic geography made it inaccessible at the cost and the scale that industrialization required. The Americas argument is equally precise. The New World provided Britain and Western Europe with what Pomeranz calls ghost acres, vast quantities of land for timber, cotton, and food production that effectively expanded the resource base of the European economies without requiring European land and labor to produce those resources. The cotton that fed the Lancashire mills came from the American South. The timber that built the ships that maintained global trade came from North American forests. The food that sustained the populations of the Sugar Islands came from provisions shipped from the mainland. The Americas were, in economic terms, an extension of the European productive base that had no equivalent in the Chinese or Indian economic worlds. The ghost acres freed up European land and European labor for industrial production in ways that the Asian economies, which had to produce their food, their fiber, and their timber from their own densely populated territories, could not replicate. The Yangtze Delta was extraordinarily productive, but it was producing food and silk for the enormous Chinese population on a fixed land base. There was no equivalent of the Americas to expand that base. There was no ghost acreage to absorb the resource demands of an industrial transition. Luck, in this argument, is not a satisfying word for what it describes. What it describes is a specific configuration of geological and geographical circumstances that gave one region of the world an energetic and resource advantage at exactly the moment when those advantages were decisive. It was not random. It was not deserved. It was the outcome of where the coal happened to be and where the European powers happened to have established their colonial presence in the preceding centuries. The second suspect is institutions. And the institutionalist argument, associated with economists like Darren Acemoglu and historians like Niall Ferguson, begins not with geology but with political structure. Europe in 1500 was not a unified empire. It was a fragmented collection of competing states, principalities, city-states, and kingdoms that were constantly at war with each other and constantly competing for economic and military advantage. This fragmentation, which looks from one angle like a source of weakness and instability, produced from another angle a competitive dynamic that drove innovation in ways that the more unified imperial systems of China and the Ottoman world did not. If a ruler in one European state suppressed a new idea, taxed merchants into poverty, or drove away skilled craftsmen, those merchants and craftsmen could move. The Netherlands received the religious refugees that Spain expelled. England received the Huguenot craftsmen that France drove out after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. The competitive pressure between states created an environment in which the most commercially and institutionally progressive policies tended to spread, because the states that adopted them attracted capital and talent from the states that did not. The development of property rights, legal systems that protected private wealth from arbitrary seizure by rulers, was another institutional advantage that the institutionalists identify as critical. Long-term investment, the kind of investment that building a factory or financing a trading company requires, is only rational if the investor has reasonable confidence that the returns will be available to them rather than confiscated by the state. The legal innovations of Northwestern Europe, the joint stock company, the limited liability corporation, the enforceable commercial contract, the independent judiciary, created an environment in which capital could be deployed at the scale that industrialization required. The institutional argument is not that Asian civilizations were irrational or unsophisticated. It is that the specific institutional configuration of Northwestern Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries was uniquely well suited to the mobilization of private capital at industrial scale. The truth, as is usually the case in historical debates of this magnitude, is probably that both suspects are guilty. The coal and the ghost acres provided the energetic and resource foundation. The institutions provided the organizational and legal framework. Together they produced something that neither alone could have generated. The Industrial Revolution was the child of luck and of institutional development in proportions that historians will probably never finally agree on. But there is a third element of the story that both the luck argument and the institutions argument tend to underemphasize. And it is the element that makes the Great Divergence not just an academic puzzle but a moral and political question that the modern world has never fully resolved. In 1750, Mughal India was the world's dominant textile producer. Indian cotton cloth, produced in Bengal and Gujarat and across the subcontinent by weavers whose skills had been refined over centuries, was the most sought-after fabric in the global market. Europeans were not buying Indian cloth because they had no choice. They were buying it because it was better. The quality, the variety, the price, the commercial sophistication of the Indian textile industry in 1750 had no equal anywhere in the world. By 1850 that industry was in ruins. The deindustrialization of India is the case study that transforms the Great Divergence from an abstract historical puzzle into a story about power and its consequences. Because what happened to the Indian textile industry was not simply the outcome of technological competition. It was the outcome of technological competition combined with political domination. And the combination of those two things produced a result that the laws of the market, operating in the absence of colonial power, would never have generated. The British Industrial Revolution produced machine-spun and machine-woven cotton cloth at costs that handloom weavers in Bengal could not match. This is the technological competition element, and it is real. The power loom and the spinning jenny and the entire mechanical infrastructure of Lancashire's textile industry transformed the economics of cotton cloth production in ways that gave British manufactured cloth a cost advantage over hand-produced Indian cloth in open market competition. But the competition was not open. Britain controlled India politically. And that political control allowed Britain to structure the terms of the competition in ways that made the outcome not just likely but inevitable. Indian textiles faced tariffs of up to 85% when exported to Britain, while British machine-made cloth entered Indian markets at minimal tariff rates. The political architecture of colonial rule was deployed in the direct service of British industrial interests, creating a trade regime that was free in name and rigged in practice. The results were catastrophic for the Indian textile regions. The weavers of Dhaka, whose muslin had been so fine that it was described by contemporaries as woven air, found themselves unable to sell their product in markets that had been structurally closed to them. The commercial infrastructure of the Indian textile industry, the merchants, the dyers, the traders, the entire ecosystem that had supported one of the world's most sophisticated manufacturing sectors, contracted and in some regions collapsed entirely. India went from exporting finished textiles to exporting raw cotton to British mills that processed it and sold the finished cloth back to India. The reversal was complete and it was not accidental. This pattern, the use of colonial political power to deindustrialize the colonized economy and convert it into a supplier of raw materials and a consumer of manufactured goods, was not unique to India. It was replicated across the colonial world with variations that reflected local circumstances but a consistent underlying logic. The Great Divergence was not simply the story of Western industrialization. It was the story of Western industrialization combined with the active suppression of industrialization elsewhere, the use of political power to ensure that the competitive advantages generated by the Industrial Revolution were not competed away by the sophisticated economies that existed in Asia and elsewhere before the divergence began. This is what makes the Great Divergence the most consequential and the most contested event in modern economic history. The revisionist historians who emphasize luck are right that the coal and the ghost acres were decisive advantages that Europe did not earn through superior culture or superior institutions. The institutionalists who emphasize property rights and competitive state systems are right that the organizational innovations of northwestern Europe created an environment uniquely suited to industrial development. But both of these arguments, taken alone, produce an incomplete picture because both of them treat the divergence as something that happened to Europe rather than something that Europe did to the world. The gap between the Yangtze Delta peasant and the English peasant in 1750 was small and arguably non-existent. The gap between their grandchildren in 1850 was enormous. And the explanation for that gap is not simply that Britain found its coal and developed its institutions. It is that Britain found its coal, developed its institutions, colonized a significant portion of the planet, used that colonial power to extract resources and suppress competition, and in doing so created a global economic architecture whose consequences are still visible in the income and wealth disparities between the former colonial powers and the former colonial territories today. The Great Divergence did not end in 1850. It is still happening. The income gap between the wealthiest and the poorest nations on Earth today traces its origins to the specific decades when a few small nations in northwestern Europe made a technological leap and used the political power that leap generated to ensure that the rest of the world served their industrial interests rather than developing its own. That is the detective story. The suspects are geology, institutions, and power. All three are guilty. And the crime scene is the modern world.